Sidetrack episode 52, Afterlife. Welcome back to A to Z History Presents the History of the Papacy. The History of the Papacy podcast is a member of the Agora podcast network, a group of independent podcasters with the goal to create thought-provoking and high-quality podcasts. This month, we're sharing the Agora Podcast Network's original content feed. The Agora original content feed is a thought-provoking mix of entertainment that covers a wide variety of topics, including current events, international relations, and interviews with many other podcasters. It's really another great podcast to add to your feed, and I think you'll enjoy it. And as always, you can learn more at agorapodcastnetwork.com. Today, I'd like to thank our Constantinople level patrons Regan, Sandy, Andy, Paul, and Dr. Jeff, as well as Alexandria level patron Chris. Patreon's a great way to support the show. You can go to patreon.com/papacy to learn more. And I've also included a link in the show notes to my Amazon wish list. When you're checking out at Amazon, you can add one of these research materials to your cart, and it would be very tremendously helpful, and I would very much appreciate it. This is the 8th and very likely final installment of Garry and Steve's Guide to the Apocalypse podcast series. We will talk about various concepts about the life one leads after their death. The afterlife. Much changed about how people envisioned the afterlife during the Second Temple period of Judaism. We will try to look at why some of these changes happened. We hope you enjoyed this series, and please feel free to share your comments. You can get in contact with us through all the different ways at a2zhistorypage.com, as well as Gary's website, which is listed in the show notes. Thank you very much for listening to this entire series and for the feedback that you've given so far. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you've enjoyed the apocalypse, because the end is nigh after all. Welcome back to Garry and Steve's Guide to the Apocalypse, and we've really gotten into the apocalypse, and as much as we've talked about this for several hours now, we've only scratched the surface, and we thought that this would be a good time to talk about the afterlife and how this whole concept of the time in what happens after a person dies, afterlife, what happens, and how did the modern conception of afterlife build from its very beginnings.
Right, so let's go back to the context of the state of the little kingdom of Judah in the Middle East and the concepts of the afterlife in the ancient Middle East. We seem to have a fair amount of information on that, from that most ancient of civilizations, the Sumerians, through to the Babylonians and the Assyrians and the Canaanites. And the concept of the afterlife that they had is just blah. That's the best way to describe it. Blah. The general idea seems to be that after you die, you go into this place of darkness and silence, and you wander around being miserable for, it seems, eternity. And interestingly, this concept of an afterlife is also very similar to the Greek and Roman concepts of an afterlife, of Hades, a place of darkness and misery. So it's interesting that these civilizations have constructed an afterlife, which is just an appalling, well, perhaps not appalling, it's like you're forced to spend Christmas at your great aunt's that you can't stand in the middle of a blizzard.
For eternity.
For eternity, and you've got nothing in common with her. She has all the wrong food. You can't use your play computer games. It's just...
It just seems to me like I was thinking about that. Where does this develop out of? You think that people sitting around the campfire are the granddads telling the boys stories, you know what, after you die, it's going to be totally boring. I mean, where does that come from? Why bother developing these really complicated systems and cultural ideas for something that's just so pointless?
I agree. I've thought the same thing myself. If you're going to come up with an afterlife, why not make it happy clappy? We're all going to be dancing with little lambs in a beautiful perpetual spring. And instead, generation after generation said, no, after you die, it's going to be really horrible. I mean, why construct that myth? What miserable old bastard started this 5,000 years ago? That's what I want to know.
Or the opposite side of the coin. Oh, Uncle Chet, he cheated in cards every time, and he's going to be tortured for that in the afterlife. You'd think from day one that would be a part of the human DNA, but it really isn't.
No, not at all. The Mesopotamian concept of an afterlife, interestingly enough, had no concept of judgment. There's no sense that you are being sent to a bad place where you're going to be actually tortured. It's just blecky. And from what we know, when you go to the afterlife, you retain your social status that you had here. So if you were a king in the real world, you got to be a king in the afterlife, but it still wasn't much fun. But you maintained your social status in some dreary sense. Priests were still priests. If you were a poor peasant hacking out the stuff, you were still at the bottom of the food chain. I mean, why would you believe that? You'd think some sort of sect would have arisen saying, yes, all the shepherds are going to have a great time, and the people who've been oppressing us are going to get in trouble. But no, everyone just goes to the same dreary place. One thing we do seem to know about the afterlife is that funerary rites were very important. Although people were dead, they still had to be supported by their families. So we find from graves and tombs and things, they're little feeding tubes and water tubes where the descendants of the dead can give them sustenance for the afterlife. Because it seems to have been believed that if the living didn't give sustenance to the dead, then the dead would be basically homeless people, beggars in the afterlife. You had to keep them fed, like sending food parcels to your great aunt who can't be bothered to leave the house or go online shopping. No, we'll send her a nice Christmas cake this year. That'll make her happy.
That's a theme that we're going to see start playing out, that memory and remembering people after they've died becomes really important.
Very important. From what I understand, the main responsibility fell on the eldest son of the dead. So it was up to him to keep the memory alive and to go back and visit his parents' grave every so often and do things. And it's thought that might be one of the origins of the common Mesopotamian and I think Jewish custom that the eldest son got twice the portion of any other children because he had the responsibility.
So it wasn't some primogenitor thing that they got the good stuff. It's that they had more responsibility, so they should have more resources.
Yeah, that seems to be exactly the case. It's a case of, okay, Gary, you're the eldest, you take care of it, and you've got to go and make sure that mum and dad are still, happy in the afterlife. So that seems to be the main thing. One thing also about ancient Mesopotamian beliefs of the afterlife is that if you didn't, keep your dead relatives happy, they might come back and haunt you. So that's another good reason for the eldest son to keep going. Not perhaps as viciously as, say, a poltergeist or something, but they could come back and make your life a little bit unpleasant. They might cause the crops to fail or your favourite lamb to die, that sort of thing.
The Egyptians, we won't really talk much about them because I think that could probably take over the whole show, but they clearly had a complicated afterlife and complicated funerary arrangements. But there again, it seemed very class-based.
That's true. I mean, your average schlub on the land didn't get a pyramid built for him, did he?
No, completely jammed full of funerary goods, and that seems to be a theme that we kind of get even in ancient China, where that the ancient emperor who they thought maybe was semi-legendary, but they found his tomb full of the terracotta army and
Oh, all right. Is this the guy with the Mercury Lake or something?
the Mercury Lake. So obviously he thought he was going to get something pretty special in the afterlife. Whether the average Joe was going to get something the level of paradise, like you said, something commensurate with what they lived in their life.
Yeah. So the hierarchy of the afterlife mirrored the hierarchy in the real world. I think one thing worth saying is that in ancient Mesopotamia, there does not seem to have been a concept of a soul, really. They had an idea called, and my Akkadian is a little rusty, but it seems to be pronounced etamu or temu or something. And the etamu is that part of you which passes into the afterlife. But it is not at all clear if the living have an etamu. It seems to have been a non-corporeal entity which was formed at the moment of death. So this is very unlike Christianity, which of course posits an immortal soul, which you have from the minute of your conception, I believe, in Catholicism, to the moment of your death. The Mesopotamians didn't really seem to believe in that concept of a soul.
And there was two times going on. We think of time as a linear thing, but the gods were living in a certain time and humans' time was much shorter. So your lifespan was very short in the big scheme of things. But then you have your spirit or whatever, your afterlife portion. And they were those two concepts of time are very different.
Yeah, that's true.
And as with everything, time comes to an end. And the different cultures had different ways that they dealt with and how they believed that time would end, and they call that eschatology. So Zoroastrianism, that was an ancient religion of the people who lived in Persia, and that the foundational texts are really old, but they were really the first religion in that area that came up with the concept of a heaven and angels and eschatology or an end time, where the other religions like classical antiquity, I don't believe in any way that they really had an idea that time ended or that time would end at some point.
No, they had no idea of that at all. I think they thought the world would continue forever. Even if you look at Aristotle, he posited an eternal world.
And classical antiquity that was living right in that same geographical area as ancient Judaism, they had pretty much the bland, gray, boring afterlife for most people. A very, very select few could go to Elysium or even be deified. Some heroes like Hercules or Heracles. And there really didn't seem to be a rhyme or a reason of who would go to Elysium.
Yeah, it does seem to be a bit random, doesn't it? The Greeks did distinguish with their demigods. They were going to go to a nice place or the stars or somewhere. But the average guy,
Yeah, the chances were very slim that the average person would go to Elysium.
Yeah. One thing I find interesting is that the Mesopotamians, and there's tremendous apparent continuity from the ancient Sumerians right through to the whole all the Mesopotamian cultures, they seem to have had pretty much the same sorts of ideas of an afterlife. But one thing that interests me is that one thing in the Mesopotamian concept of an afterlife was the idea that the dead person had to pass over a river, fight some demons before they could enter their final resting place. Now, I can only think that the Greeks picked that up with their concept of the river Styx, because it comes straight out of the Mesopotamian religion. And I find
it sure does.
Yeah, I find it hard to believe they invented it independently.
To me, that whole idea of going over the river Styx and paying a boatman, it all seems so bureaucratic. Like you're dead and now you have to pay somebody and wait to go to this boring, it's like going to the I'm sure Australia has a version of the Auto Bureau, the place where you get your license and your license plate, and you get your number, and you have number A75, and they've just called A1.
I know exactly what you mean. Yeah.
And you're going to be in this place that has no windows for a long, long time.
Yeah, no windows, hard seats. There's nothing to do, nothing to look at. And you're hoping that the guy with A74, who's on his mobile, will ignore the fact when the little lights flash, A74, A74. Are you seeing it? No. A75, thank you. But I was here. No, missed it.
Or they might have a small TV playing some inane daytime television program.
Oh, yes. A program you would never watch in your right mind. Or some, the morning brunch, breakfast news show with ads and things. That's hell. That's the Mesopotamian idea of hell. Well, not hell, the afterlife.
But then the Christians and the Jews and in Second Temple Judaism, things start to change a little bit.
They do. The ancient Jewish concept of the afterlife, as shown in the Old Testament, seems to be pretty much the same as the Mesopotamian. Everyone goes to Sheol, this bland, boring, dull place. Only two people have gone to heaven or some sort of other post-mortem existence, and they are the prophet Elijah, who was taken up, and the antediluvian monarch Enoch. And even Enoch is, in the Old Testament period anyway, he's just a weird aberration. So that's the Old Testament Jewish conception of the afterlife. It's just the same the same mediocrity as everyone else's. It's only with first the book of Daniel and then later Enoch that you find new ideas coming up that the afterlife simply isn't basically a refuse ground of wandering lost souls. It's in fact quite an exciting place in one sense, where you go to be judged. That's a radically new concept in ancient Judaism, and in fact in the entire Middle East, that the afterlife isn't just a resting place. It's a place where you go to be judged, and some people are going to go to a bad place if they've been bad in this world, and some will go to a good place. Radically new idea, and it first appears, the first inkling is in the book of Daniel, where in a throwaway sentence it mentions this concept, but it only really appears in our dear friend First Enoch.
Good old First Enoch.
Good old First Enoch. I think it is a complete tragedy that we have absolutely no idea what individual or school was responsible for it. I would really like to meet that guy and ask him, where did you get this stuff from? How did you evolve this stuff? I mean, oh well, until the time machine's invented, we'll never know.
That's the thing with a lot of those books. You'd love to have the meta story, and that's just not something that ancient writers were into. If you were saying that you were Enoch writing a book when it was probably not written by Enoch.
No, it's probably written by some poor guy called Paltiel or something who's sitting in a mud hut and thinking, geez, I got a lot of time on my hands.
And you don't get the backstory of why the book was written.
That's true. Why was it written? We're really unclear about that. I think the only sense that people get is that the time was written, Judah was pretty much squashed by the Hellenistic empires, and they were looking for a future salvation, which the Old Testament really doesn't provide, because the Old Testament has specifically said, you are going to have this kingdom forever, and someone of the line of David will rule over you forever. And that manifestly had been blown apart. So the apocalyptic literature seems to have just arisen as partly a response to that.
We start getting in this Second Temple period all these different ideas about afterlife and the end of times. And the early Christians and the early post-destruction of the temple Jews start picking and choosing out of this big pot of ideas what they're going to fold into their belief system.
Some of the ideas in First Enoch which have been retained are ideas of, for example, that there's a difference between a physical body and an immortal soul. That's a brand new idea. The idea that there is a place called paradise, or Pardes, I think that's how it's pronounced, which basically means orchard or garden.
And that's one of those ideas that filtered in through the Persians.
So from Enoch, the Judaism after the destruction of the temple picked up the concepts of a body and soul, the concept of a paradise versus a Gehenna, which was the place you went to punishment. In the apocalyptic literature, Gehenna is sometimes it's the same as Sheol, sometimes it's not the same as Sheol. By the time of the early Christian era, Gehenna and Sheol had been clearly differentiated. Gehenna was the place where you went to be punished. Sheol seems to have been a vast waiting room, like the final scenes of that movie Beetlejuice, where you would get sorted. But you wouldn't get sorted until the end of times and the judgment to come. That's another thing which is introduced in the apocalyptic literature, that there will be a judgment. Now, an interesting thing is, it's not a judgment after you die. Oh no, the judgment only happens with the apocalypse, with the return of the Messiah. Then God does all the sorting. Until then, who knows where you are, what's happening. It's really very vague.
We thought there were some key terms that we thought we might define and talk a little bit about, because I think that'll help us understand a little bit more. One of the big terms is Abraham's bosom, the book of life, eternal memory, Gehenna, Sheol, Hades, hell, falling asleep in the Lord. And a lot of these terms are used sort of loosey-goosey, that they're not really specifically defined. So one person might say you're falling asleep in the Lord, and then you're in Abraham's bosom. But as Garry was saying, judgment doesn't happen. There was actually a two-phase judgment that came along in Christianity, that there was a sort of initial judgment upon death, and then another judgment at the end of times, or at the day of judgment. I mean, you can search all day for interesting quotes from the Gospels about the end of life, or at the afterlife. One of them is, the Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all evildoers, and throw them into the furnace of fire. There men will weep and gnash their teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. And that's from Matthew 13. And that's a funny thing. Jesus often says the gnashing of teeth. And there was actually a funny thing from a podcast that both Garry and I are aficionados of, called the NT podcast, by a Duke professor called Mark Goodacre, where he tells a story about someone asks Jesus, what if I don't have teeth? How will I gnash them? And Jesus is supposed to have said that teeth will be provided. And a whole scholarly tradition built up around this thing that was actually made up by a biblical scholar.
Oh.
So that shows you kind of what we're dealing with here, and the type of scholars that get into biblical scholarship, that go and purposefully go and keep a legend going that was of their own creation. Now, the Christians definitely had an idea that something happened when you died, and that you went someplace. That it even happens in Luke and his passion narrative in Luke 23, where Jesus said to one of the people who was being crucified with him, truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. So I mean, clearly right there, that's a pretty big inference that there is something after death. If you're being crucified, you're going to die pretty soon. And Jesus is saying that when we die, we're going to be someplace.
And that's something which is simply not present in Second Temple Judaism, or in modern Judaism for that matter. But the idea that immediately after death, you are going to be a conscious entity somewhere, seems to have been a Christian innovation from what I can see.
A big part of the Christian concept was, especially the very early Christian concept, one of the examples that's often brought up is there was the parable of the rich man and the poor man, of Lazarus, and Lazarus was the poor man. And when the rich man dies, he's being tortured and because he's rich, and that's sort of the way that it became interpreted. But originally they think that it was interpreted in the fact that, you know what, when they died, the rich man got his in life, and in the afterlife, you're just not going to have a great afterlife if you had a great actual life, where Lazarus is poor and he's in Abraham's bosom. It's sort of like a great balancing at the end. So instead of in the older traditions where when you die, you hold on to your status, it's almost like your status is flip-flopped in the afterlife.
That's true. That's quite an inversion from the old Mesopotamian beliefs, isn't it? Yeah, it's a complete inversion.
And this whole idea of Gehenna, I found this interesting, is that Gehenna is a Hellenization of Himnam, which was a place near Jerusalem. They're not exactly sure exactly where it was. It was a valley. And jump in any time, Gary, if you have any of your perspective on this. But this valley was actually a place where it was basically the city garbage dump of Jerusalem. And it was constantly kept on fire. And fire being, it helped manage the trash situation, as well as purification. That's really, I read an article about that Jerusalem was one of the cleanest places in the Roman Empire. It was really where you hit this idea where the Jewish Second Temple Judaism almost obsession with ritual purity combined with Roman civil engineering, and you get a place that was probably next to spotless compared to many other places in the Roman Empire.
Now, that's a good point. I'd forgotten about that. I mean, yes, it's clear in the Dead Sea Scrolls that ritual washing was a critical part of their daily life, wasn't it? Whereas the Romans, well, they didn't even wash that much as far as I know. They cleaned themselves with olive oil. Ugh.
If this place, Gehenna, was an actual real place, which archaeologists kind of have an idea of where it is, but not sure. Think about a place where the garbage is being dumped. If they find dead people in the street, which was a common occurrence, that's where they got dumped. So the people, somebody who died, didn't even get a ritual funeral. They just got chucked in with the garbage that's constantly on fire. If you can think of a place that's probably just about as close to hell as you could possibly imagine, that would have to be the place.
Yes, it certainly sounds horrible. I mean, I'm just thinking of images of those modern garbage dumps outside Manila or something. I mean, whoa, bad place.
Gehenna and Sheol, they sort of started to meld into each other and get the same connotation, and they started to become used interchangeably, Gehenna and Sheol. And I think it's sort of the way I envisioned it is, I don't know if it's an idiom that's used in Australia or universally, but being sent to prison, oftentimes people say you've been sent up the river.
Yes, we know that expression.
And that's a shorthand that long ago in New York City, the main jail that people were sent to was north up the Hudson River in Sing Sing.
Oh, that's where it comes from.
Yeah. Oh. So if you were sent up the river, you were sent to Sing Sing, which is, I don't know how quite, it's nowadays you can drive there pretty quickly, but if you were sent in the 17 or 1800s. That was a long way to go. And, you were basically being sent away where you were going to be completely separated from family and friends for a long time. Or Bedlam is another example of that, where a physical place takes on all sorts of other connotations.
Australia's the same. Remember, we were invented as a prison colony. The Brits sent tens of thousands of people here. No way of getting back.
And did Australia at one time, if somebody said Australia, did it give people a connotation that they were being sent someplace bad? Like, oh, if you don't finish your homework, we're shipping you off to Australia.
The British expression in the 19th century was transported. So if you stole a loaf of bread or something, we'll transport you if you don't watch out.
The Christians really, they were dealing with the ideas that they had at that point, Gehenna, Sheol, and then they started to fold in the idea of Hades. And in the New Testament, generally, if somebody was in Hades, it was a place that wasn't paradise, and it really wasn't hell either. It was just a warehouse of souls. So you can see in the New Testament that they're really trying to figure out this idea of what happens in the afterlife. Most of the New Testament and even the letters of Paul are predicated that the judgment's coming really soon. So it really doesn't matter. And it's not until later in Paul where people really start to think about, well, you know what? Jesus doesn't appear to be coming in this generation, so what happens until the day of judgment?
Yes, the early Christians do seem to very much have been expecting the return any minute now. I wonder when was the period when they finally gave that up? As you said, Paul seemed to have abandoned the idea towards the end of his life, but I wonder when the whole idea just faded out and they thought, oh, no, we've got it wrong.
It seems that in that time period, if you think about it, right around the destruction of the Second Temple, that's when, obviously, that's a big, even for the early Christians, who the line between an early Christian Jew and an early Jewish Christian, there was no line there. It was a fuzzy borderline where people crossed back and forth constantly. You think about it, that first generation of people who follow Jesus, they're going to start dying in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s AD. And that's around, Paul would have died in around the late 50s AD. That's when you're starting to think, well, you know what? Maybe this imminent return isn't quite as imminent as we thought it was. It really was in that era, about the time that Paul, at the end of Paul's writings, and then after that, where the Christians start thinking like, what happens when you die? And that initial judgment idea where you're either going to go to some sort of place where you're punished, or you're going to go to some place that's good and kind of cool your heels until the final judgment comes.
After the fall of the Second Temple, Jewish views about the afterlife, the resurrection, and the Messiah take a decidedly dampened turn. In all the apocalyptic literature, these have been very vibrant concepts and really fairly well defined. There is some sort of post-mortem existence. There will be a general resurrection of the dead when the righteous will be separated out from the wicked. This will be associated with the coming of the Messiah and God's final judgment. After the fall of the temple, all these concepts get buried at the bottom of Judaism. And today, they really just don't figure in the religion. From the Jewish people I've talked to and the things I've read, the whole notions of an afterlife are vague. They're not considered to be relevant. They're a little bit embarrassing to talk about. No one's really got any firm ideas about them. And they just don't care. It's not something they talk about. Even the concept of a Messiah. You won't find many Jews, even the most learned ones who are interested in it, really talking about it that much. It's just simply not there. And that's the exact opposite to Christianity, where the notions of an afterlife and the Messiah are front and center.
It seems to me like in what a little I know about it, it seems like the ultra-Orthodox and the Hasidic Jewish communities are a little bit more concerned about the coming of Messiah, and they probably talk about it more than any other group.
That does seem to be the case. What was that New York rabbi, Lubavitcher rabbi or something, who some believe was the Messiah?
And just generally, it's more a part of their religion or how they practice their religion than it is in other Jewish groupings.
Yeah, that's certainly from what I've heard. Reform and conservative Jews, I think, regard those notions as a little bit on the wacky side, and they just don't impinge on the normal thinking of a Jew, except for these ultra orthodox who seem to have some, as you said, that's the only place where they seem to appear.
Moving into our next. There's this part where after you die, but then what's the Jewish thought about the judgment? Because all that comes from Second Temple Judaism, this idea of a final judgment.
In modern Judaism, again, that sounds very vague. People are aware of it, but they don't really know what it's about. I mean, there's no concept of it in the Old Testament, the Tanakh. There's almost no concept of it in the Mishnah. Intellectual Jews don't really start thinking about it again after the fall of the temple until the early Middle Ages with scholars like Maimonides. So there's this huge gap where really no one's talking about it. And even Maimonides, he says a few things about it, but that's about it. I get the general impression that it's something that has been left purposely vague, and the basic notion is we don't know. It's up to God to work it out and do whatever he's going to do, and we do not have the power to work out what will actually happen. That's the impression I get.
With Christianity, I think that there's a lot of different views that go through all the different Christian sects. And there's also a lot of folklore that gets attached to it.
Like the rapture.
Like the rapture or the red devil with horns that doesn't really come out of... It's not directly attached to the Gospels or any of the early writings. It's things that were brought in from other cultures and syncretized with Christianity. Generally, the Christian churches talk about salvation, and they all have different ideas of what salvation is. Really, the Catholic Church believes that there's no salvation outside of the church. And really, most Christians believe something to that effect. Origen taught a universal salvation, and there's some idea of that floating around. What the church is an interesting question, because Jesus said in the Gospels that he was the church. And who fits inside of the church really depends on whose definition it is of what the church is. In that way, the Catholics and Christianity, in a lot of ways, especially sacramental Christianity, are believing in more of a corporate salvation than they are in concerned about individual salvation. It's important to be a part of the church and doing what the church says and being right by the church. And that's how you get to the afterlife and then ultimately to judgment.
Right. And how does that differ from the Orthodox position or the Eastern Church position?
It's similar in a way. The Eastern position is generally that people do good works and fast and participate in the sacraments, and it's all going towards an idea called theosis, and that's becoming like Jesus. And at some point, you're hopefully living your life and even into your afterlife, that you're trying to get close to Jesus. And that's an idea that goes through a lot of Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity. It's the afterlife, the good of afterlife is your proximity to God. And the further away you are from God is the worse your punishment is. If you're really far away from God, that's not where you want to be. And it's not a punishment that you're getting poked with pitchforks. It's that you don't have the same proximity to God as somebody else does.
Right, it's simply being out of God's vision or presence. That is the punishment itself.
The way you live your life is moving you either closer to God or further away from God. There's a later idea of the ladder of divine ascent. I think that's maybe from the 300-400s. It might be a little later than that. Don't quote me. But you're on a ladder climbing up to heaven, and sometimes you fall back a few rungs, sometimes you fall off the ladder completely, and it's really your choices that lead to that. But ultimately, the choice is Jesus's. He's the final judge, and he's going to be the one who judges you or not. The Roman Catholic Church started to move more in a position where, and then a lot of the Protestant groups move into this position where your fate isn't up to you at all in your salvation. And it really doesn't matter what you do. You're either a part of the elect or you're not. And the Catholics don't subscribe to that exactly, but they had some of the precursors of this idea through Augustine, that man's totally depraved and you can only hope for a salvation through the grace of Jesus.
Right, is this something to do with the faith versus works distinction, which I've never really quite understood?
Yes.
Okay.
The Protestant thinkers would really build upon all of that. And I wouldn't say it's vague in Augustine. Augustine was doing that through a completely Roman Catholic, Western Christian lens. And the later Protestant thinkers would start to comb through Augustine and develop more of these ideas like, by faith alone, you can reach salvation. And salvation takes on a different idea with the Protestant reforms than maybe it did with the Orthodox churches in the East that were going for this idea of theosis, of building your way towards a salvation, where in the West, to some degree, and later on with the Protestants, your salvation is really determined at a point.
All right.
At the earliest time, though, none of that's defined in any way.
Right, okay. So it took Christianity, 1,500 years to codify its concepts in its various forms.
And it's still developing.
And it's still developing, yeah.
If you look at different churches, a really important part of sacramental churches is that the dead are prayed for and they're remembered, and that they have prayer services at different times of their life. And even in modern Judaism, where people go to their loved ones' graves and place a rock on their Yarzeit, or the anniversary of their death, it's really, a lot of it keeps tying back into that the dead need to be remembered by the living.
Right.
You go back to that, I'll try and find the quote, but when Jesus is asked about somebody dying, and he said, "Let the dead bury the dead," he's really saying that the focus needs to be on how you're living right now. It's a really hard concept to get your mind around, that you're striving for an afterlife, but you need to really be concerned about earthly things, but don't be too concerned with earthly things.
Oh, he's having it both ways.
And that's probably what the whole history of Christianity is trying to figure out, how much needs to be based on what's done now, what's that intermediate afterlife, and then what's the judgment. And they're really things that you can't completely quantify and the Gospels don't completely define. Another thing that needs to be added, I think, with Christianity is the idea of purgation and purgatory, and just the whole concept of fire. Fire is really an important part of Christian afterlife. Our concept of hell is that people are burning, and the whole idea of Gehenna, where this place was on fire. Fire in the earliest time was, and it really comes from the Zoroastrians and the Persians had a really high regard for fire, but in a different way. And a lot of people, and what I tend to think is that these ideas of fire were probably flowing in from Persia, picking and choosing from them. But the idea of fire initially was that you would go through a time of purgation. Your sins are getting pushed and pulled out of you in preparation for the general judgment or the final judgment. And that by that time, if you're getting worked out, it's kind of like when you go on a cleanse and they make you sit in the steam room and sweat it out. Hopefully by the time you've gone through this purging fire, that you'll be without sin at the end. And one of the things that reminded me of that was at the end of the Star Wars, the first three, but they're not really the first three, they're the middle three, but the one at the end where Luke Skywalker killed his dad, Darth Vader, and they're sitting around the fire, and the ghosts of Yoda and Obi-Wan Kenobi, and then his dad come in. And so we find out that Darth Vader was actually Luke's dad, but his dad went through this purgation where he did really bad stuff as Darth Vader, but he did good stuff as Anakin. I think the earliest Christian idea of the afterlife between death and the general judgment was an idea of balancing out the good and the bad, and you were punished for the bad, but the whole plan in the end was that you would be good before the final judgment. I don't know about you, Gary, but I feel that even in places like in North America and Australia and Europe, where the society is becoming more and more secularized and people aren't following religions as much, there's still an idea of an apocalypse and an end of times. And I almost wonder, is that why might that be so ingrained, especially when it seems when we keep going back, that there doesn't seem to be that idea, but now that it's sort of an obsession with zombie movies and the like.
I'm wondering how much of that is a North American preoccupation versus a European one. Because you don't see many apocalyptic movies coming out of Europe, do you? Whereas they're really quite common in American pop culture.
Yeah, that is true. And another one that's maybe a little bit more controversial is that there seems to be a strain in the really, really extreme of the environmental movement, where they're not talking about, let's tweak carbon a little bit so that we can, the ones who are saying that in 10 years the planet's going to be unlivable.
Yeah, why do they say that? I mean, it's so patently just wrong. Yeah, but there is this apocalyptic strain in the climate change debates. Hopefully that'll recede. I just don't understand why they're saying it.
And it just seems that, to me, that there just seems to be almost a drive for apocalypse.
Yeah. Some people seem to want it to happen. Some people seem to want it to happen as a punishment for the wicked opposition, it seems.
And I wonder if that's an outgrowth of Christianity, and that's Christianity and religion still drive the idea that there will be a judgment. And this is a secularized version of it. I just don't know.
No. I'm wondering how much of it comes out of specifically evangelical Protestant Christianity versus the sacramental churches.
Yeah, where there's a lot of the shades of gray with what happens are removed, and then it becomes very stark that there's heaven and hell, and people are getting assigned, and you better get on the right track. I think in general that maybe this goes through cycles where when economic times are bad, and it seems like times in the global political with warfare and that sort of thing, that when people think times are bad, then they're looking more to this apocalypse or an end times so that you can get a do-over.
Yes, wasn't there a resurgence in apocalyptic beliefs towards the end of the First World War?
Yeah, I believe so, and I think that that's where there were some apocalyptic fiction came out, and there was just a general negative outlook. Where then you come out of World War II, where things are on the uptick, you don't get as much of that.
No, because that seems to have been a righteous war. I think it's interesting to describe the First World War as a negative outlook.
Or the people who came out of it, who came out of the trenches, who rejected everything that they had before, and it really changed their outlook on life. A lot of the writers who came out, I'm trying to think of a few of them.
There's a famous British poet, isn't there, who died? Wilfrid someone? Well, look how it changed Downton Abbey.
And a lot of people's their things weren't looking as good at the end of World War One, at least initially. And it really wasn't until the 20s where things were starting to pick up. But then when the global Great Depression hits, you start getting a more of a down attitude.
Yeah.
So it seems like that sort of thing is cyclical, where people are thinking, oh, the apocalypse is imminent. And that's when you have the idea, when we go all the way back to the destruction of the Second Temple. If you're a Jew in AD 70, if that's not the end of the world, we've said this before, if the destruction of the temple doesn't seem like that's the end of the world, then you don't know what is.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. You know, I was just thinking, another resurgence in apocalyptic thinking might be the late 70s. I was thinking of that guy's book, what is it, The Late Great Planet Earth?
Oh, yeah, and when inflation went crazy and people couldn't afford to put gas in their car. Another time is during the Black Plague.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, of course. I mean, that would have appeared as the end of the world, wouldn't it?
Well, that seems to be the apocalypse that really probably sets the theme of today with a lot of the post-apocalyptic literature. If you're living in medieval Europe where you live in a city and half the people die within a few months.
Really quick.
If that doesn't, that's another time where if you live during that time, if that doesn't seem like the end of days is imminent, I don't know what is. And it really changes the whole social order.
Yes, that's true. The upend of the social order, beginnings of proto-capitalism, I think, end of serfdom. The world turned upside down, to repurpose that phrase.
Maybe in the end that really is a human characteristic, where when things are on the uptick, you're not thinking about the end of times. But as things seem to be getting worse for you, then it does seem like the end of times.
Yeah.
And you want to embrace it. Well, this was to wrap up the series in this way. This long series, we've gone through a lot of different material, and I think that this was a good place to end it. There's obviously a lot of different routes we can take, and if there are paths you want to go down with us, then you can let us know for sure.
Yep, and tell us if you think that the end of the world is nigh.
And it depends on what your definition of nigh is.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
The long view nigh or a short run nigh.
Yeah, later this afternoon or maybe in a couple of decades.
Wrapping up this series, we're not technically going to say that it's wrapped up. If you want us to add more, we will be happy to add more. We have a couple of more ideas of future episodes that should be coming out soon that I think are pretty good. Should we give a little sneak preview?
Oh, What if I mentioned Australian actors? Would that ring any bells, people? No? Okay.
And bodies of water.
Large bodies of water doing violent things and some very good production values.
Armies getting trapped in water. I think that'll give you a little hint of where we're going with this, where we're thinking about putting together a couple of series where we do movie reviews of biblical movies and movies generally about religion. So I think that should be good. If you have some movies that you'd like us to tackle, we have a few that we're talking about, but definitely send those ideas in too. So ending this series, I've been Steve, and I'm the host of the History of the Papacy podcast.
And I'm Gary from the History in the Bible podcast.
And we will talk to you next time.
Toodaloo.